It's not just about economics. This isn't a numbers game, nor a battle between superpowers. What we're witnessing is a tectonic shift, invisible to most, but brutal to those who know how to look. We've been living inside a global routine that seemed stable, a system that, though unfair, was at least predictable, until it stopped being so. Because power, once it overflows, no longer needs justification. And when a leader starts acting as if the world were their personal chessboard, the pawns begin to rebel, and the entire board cracks. There are questions that stats can't answer. What happens when there are no allies left, only rivals? What happens when hegemony stops inspiring respect and starts provoking rejection? Today, I invite you to look beyond the headlines, beyond politics, beyond agendas, to see into the soul of a system that's breaking apart. Because what's coming is not just a crisis, it's a rebirth. And if you've made it this far, write in the comments, "Awake," because this is the beginning of something that can no longer be stopped. When a global power starts making decisions without logic, without allies, without care, it stops being a leader and becomes a threat. What if the real enemy isn't out there, but in the mirror? If you've ever felt that the very thing you trusted collapsed before your eyes, tell me below. There were no warnings, no meetings, no diplomacy. Just a signature, a social media post, and the echo of a storm that began to spread out of control. That's how Donald Trump shook the global board once again. With an abrupt decree, he imposed a 30% tariff on products from Mexico and the European Union. And he did it without hesitation, as if it were a mere political update, when in reality, he was lighting a fuse that could set half the world on fire. Fires don't always start with flames. Sometimes they begin with arrogance, with the belief that power grants the right to act without consequences. But in geopolitics, every action has an echo, and that echo doesn't stop where you want it to. Trump claimed Mexico wasn't stopping fentanyl trafficking, and that Europe was taking unfair advantage of the US. But his words weren't seeking solutions, they were seeking justification. Because deep down, he wasn't correcting mistakes, he was imposing his will. The question isn't why he did it. The real question is why he thought he could do it without paying the price. Every decision made without consensus, every unilateral move, every impulsive gesture builds a domino effect that not only topples treaties, it erodes trust. And once trust is broken, no agreement ever feels the same again. Some fires don't begin with flames, but with arrogance. And have you ever stood in the middle of a storm someone else unleashed without warning? Comment fire if you saw the disaster coming, but it was already too late. At first, there were words, then statements, then urgent calls, and finally, something more powerful, a collective decision. Europe and Mexico didn't sit idle, not this time. What once would have been a symbolic diplomatic protest turned into an organized response. Brussels activated its economic defense mechanisms. Mexico summoned its diplomatic corps, and together they launched a joint strategy no one expected this swiftly. Because when punishment becomes routine, resistance becomes instinct. It was no longer just about protecting exports or defending treaties. It was about something deeper, dignity. For years, Mexico was treated like the lesser partner, Europe like an ally expected to obey. But that era seems to be ending. Mirror measures are being drafted. Sanctions worth 21 billion euros are on the table. And for the first time in years, the responses aren't timid, they're firm. This isn't just a political moment, it's a spiritual transformation. It's the moment when those who always stayed silent start speaking with clarity. And they do it not out of resentment, but with resolve. When you've been hit enough times, your skin learns to harden. Have you also grown tired of yielding, of staying quiet to avoid discomfort? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters too. Sometimes fate doesn't shout. It simply marks a date on the calendar and waits. August 1st might seem like just another day, but it's not. That day, the new tariffs were set to take effect, and with them, something deeper began to crack. This isn't just about taxes, it's a breaking point. An invisible line, once crossed, there's no going back. The supply chains that for decades connected the world like veins in one body will begin to choke. Trade agreements, woven patiently over years, will begin to unravel. And economies, fragile as human emotions, will begin to panic. But beyond the markets, what's truly trembling is the soul of the global order. Because if August 1st becomes the start of a new isolation, a trade war with no strategy, then we're not just witnessing a crisis, we're witnessing the end of an era in which the United States set the rules and everyone else followed. An era that maybe deserved to end, but not like this. The question is, who's truly ready for what comes next? Some days seem normal until they split the world in two. And you, do you feel like you're also standing at a point of no return in your life? Write the word threshold if you're crossing that invisible line into something that has no turning back. There are decisions that feel like power plays, and others that feel like the desperate cries of someone who no longer knows what to do. These new tariffs didn't come with a strategy. There was no roadmap, no contingency plan, just willpower. But willpower without direction is like a river without a course. It destroys instead of builds. Under Trump's leadership, the U.S. has stopped acting from geopolitical wisdom and started reacting from impulse, from emotion, from political whim. A measure is imposed, a tweet is posted, blame is assigned. But behind that media storm, there's no compass. Businesses wait for clarity. Nations look for signs, but all they find is noise. And in the meantime, the gears of the global system start to grind. Investors retreat, allies grow suspicious, markets shudder. Because chaos doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it arrives as disorder, as a lack of vision, as a string of improvised decisions that together build a maze with no exit. The world needs leadership, not ego. It needs direction, not imposition. A ship without a rudder doesn't sail, it sinks. And you, have you ever felt like your life was moving forward with no direction? Tell me below. Sometimes sharing is the first step to taking back control. First came Europe, then Mexico. And slowly, quietly, others began to watch and to move. South Korea, India, Japan, Brazil. They haven't made a loud noise, but they're already reshaping their alliances. They're revising their treaties, redrawing their trade routes. Because what seemed like a local reaction has become a global response. This is no longer about one nation defending itself from another. This is about a coalition forming, not out of convenience, but out of survival. And the most powerful thing about this union is that it's born from shared exhaustion, from a desire to never again be subordinate, from the understanding that when one stands alone, they grow weaker. But when many stand together, they can rewrite the rules. Power no longer lies in the scream of the strongest. It lives in the echo of those who are tired of staying silent. When the wolf howls long enough, the pack learns to attack. Do you believe real change only happens when we unite? Comment pack if you believe in the strength of a we that refuses to kneel. Some leaders confuse independence with isolation. Trump has tried to present each of his decisions as a bold act of sovereignty. But true sovereignty isn't built with walls or sanctions. It's built with respect, with cooperation, with fair agreements. What's the point of shouting freedom if it means burning bridges that took decades to build? Some believe the United States is regaining its strength, but in truth, it's spreading distrust. Because when a nation acts as if the world owes it obedience, it's not being strong, it's being dangerous. And that danger isn't paid for by governments, it's paid for by people, by exporters who lose their clients, by consumers facing impossible prices, by workers watching their factories close. The cost of a miscalibrated ego can be the hunger of millions. Misguided pride can cost more than war. Have you ever felt that someone's pride destroyed something valuable? Share it below. Your story may echo the feelings of many who are living through the same. Many are calling this a trade war, but that label is just a mask. Because what's happening isn't just economic conflict, it's a fracture in the global order. It's not just about tariffs or trade balances or renegotiated deals. It's about something much deeper, the end of an era where the world seemed to move toward integration. The United States, once the architect of global trade, is now tearing down the very pillars it helped build. And in doing so, it's not just challenging its partners, it's challenging the very model of international cooperation. Mexico, Europe, Asia, they're all rewriting their priorities. Old roots are fading. Yesterday's allies no longer feel safe. And new blocs are forming, born not out of hope, but out of caution. This isn't just an economic reset, it's a historical mutation. The reconfiguration of alliances, the unraveling of certainties, the birth of a new game where no one holds the map. It's not treaties that are breaking, it's futures. Are you ready to leave behind what you thought you knew and face what's coming next? Comment reconfiguration if you feel like you too are entering a chapter with no instruction manual. While presidents argue in front of cameras, the stock market speaks in silence.
Markets have no flags, no ideologies. They only understand one thing: trust. And when that trust is broken, they don't make speeches, they flee. Wall Street trembles, currencies shake, and investments vanish, as if they know something governments refuse to admit. Because while world leaders play their power games, money already senses the consequences. Trump can claim everything is under control, but the numbers whisper otherwise. Crashes aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they come drip by drip, a slow leak that quietly eats away at the economy, like internal bleeding you don't see until it's too late. The economy doesn't scream, it bleeds out. Do you feel like everything's falling apart, but in silence? Tell me. Sometimes what matters most isn't what you hear, but what you feel. There's a cruel irony playing out in history, and this time it has a name and a face: Trump's voters. The ones who cheered for tariffs, the ones who believed protection meant prosperity. They'll be the first to feel the hit. Because when Mexican goods get more expensive, it'll be small American businesses that suffer. When Europe strikes back with tariffs, it'll be rural factories that lose their contracts. And when the world starts turning to new partners, it'll be the agricultural states, the same ones that voted red, left behind. Protectionism promises safety, but delivers isolation. It promises greatness, but sows scarcity. Fire, once lit, doesn't care who you are. It doesn't choose between friend and foe. It only burns. He who sows fire doesn't get to choose where it burns first. Have you ever watched someone trying to protect something end up destroying the very thing they loved? Comment irony if that paradox has hurt you too. There was a time when Brussels spoke cautiously, measured every word, avoided conflict, chose lukewarm diplomacy, afraid to trigger a storm. That time is over. Today, Europe speaks clearly. It designs countermeasures, it activates defenses, And most importantly, it no longer seeks approval. Because when patience runs out, courage is born. And when respect turns into abuse, it's not only right, it's necessary to turn courtesy into self-defense. Brussels no longer just wants to negotiate, it wants to protect its model, defend its industries, and show the world that it too can roar. This isn't revenge, it's dignity. This is no longer about showing strength, it's about refusing to be weak. When you stop fearing, you start building. Have you also grown tired of giving in out of fear? Write it down. Your story might inspire someone who's still trembling but wants to rise. For decades, the world spun around a clear axis. Washington dictated, Europe balanced, and the rest waited. But now that center is beginning to blur, and in its place, new poles are emerging. New lights.
India weaves alliances in silence. Brazil is redrawing its role in Latin America. South Korea is stepping out from the shadows of giants. And Africa is no longer just a continent of resources. It's a continent of ideas, of futures, of voice. This is no longer a world divided between powers and followers. Now everyone wants to write their own rules, forge their own paths, defend their own dreams. What once looked like chaos is actually a new order in the making. More complex, more uncertain, but also more fair. When the sun stops warming, the stars find their place. Do you believe we're entering a new era where everyone can shine? Comment New Axis if you feel the time has come for other voices to rise. At first, it was all diplomacy, talks, statements, ceasefires. But over time, the anger stopped being economic and became emotional. It's no longer about tariffs, not even about treaties. It's about respect. Mexico doesn't respond just to protect its exports. It responds out of pride, out of memory, out of refusal to be painted as the problem when it's been a bridge, a partner, an ally. The same is true in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. Because when you're humiliated once, you may stay silent. When it happens twice, you might make excuses. But when it becomes a pattern, the soul rises up. And then the response is no longer economic. It's symbolic. It's historical. Dignity isn't bought, it's defended. Have you ever felt someone cross the line of what you should tolerate? Tell me. Your story might reflect the journey of many who are still searching for the courage to say, enough. Germany used to seek compromise. Mexico sought understanding. Japan, balance. They were allies, partners, bound not only by trade, but by shared history, by common values, by trust. But that trust began to break. First came the threats, then the one-sided conditions, then the open disdain, and finally, the inevitable defense. What once strategic alliances have become trenches. Yesterday's friends have raised shields, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. Because when a leader abuses power, the followers awaken. And when strength turns into domination, respect becomes resistance. He who mistreats his allies ends up alone. Have you also had to walk away from someone who didn't know how to value you? Comment awakening. Sometimes the most powerful act of love is saying, this is where it ends. While governments negotiate, something deeper is happening. Silent, invisible, powerful. Ordinary people are starting to question. People no longer believe everything their president says. They no longer repeat everything they hear on television. Now they ask, they investigate, they doubt. In the US, workers are starting to wonder if this so-called protection is really helping them. In Europe, young people are demanding a future that's not just profitable, but sustainable. In Mexico, communities are realizing their fight isn't against a single country, but against an unequal system. This isn't a political revolution. It's a revolution of consciousness. Because real change doesn't begin in parliaments. It begins in the mind of someone who, on an ordinary day, decides to stop believing everything and starts thinking for themselves. When the people start thinking, the powerful start shaking. Have you started questioning everything too? Write it down. You might not have all the answers, but you've already taken the most important step, asking the questions. For years, the United States set the pace for the world, with its economy, with its military, with its image. It was the center of gravity, the loudest voice in any room. But something has changed. Today, its decisions are no longer commands, they're provocations. And what once inspired obedience now fuels resistance. Nations no longer align out of fear. They unite out of necessity. They rise out of dignity. Because even the greatest giant, when it stops listening, ends up alone. China is responding. Europe is organizing. Latin America is mobilizing. And that old game board where only one hand moved the pieces has shattered. Those who wear the crown too long forget they can fall. Do you feel power shifting, changing hands, changing shapes, changing values? Comment change if you also sense that the world no longer spins the way it used to. When we hear the words trade war, it sounds like a distant, abstract conflict, something for the elites. But the wounds, they don't fall on politicians. They fall on everyday people. Tariffs aren't just numbers in cold reports. They're a mother who can no longer afford the same groceries. A worker who loses their job because the company can't export anymore. A student who delays their education because their family can't cover the cost. Geopolitics quietly invades the dinner plate. It slips into the silence of homes where rent can no longer be paid. And that doesn't make the headlines. A family doesn't eat geopolitics, but they pay its price. Have you felt it firsthand? Tell me, because behind every international conflict, there are millions of personal stories that deserve to be heard. When a factory shuts down its machines, it's not just production that stops. A routine stops. A sense of pride dims. A hope is frozen. Many workers don't just lose a paycheck. They lose a sense of purpose, the reason to get up, the peace that comes from knowing effort leads to reward. The streets grow quieter. Children look at their parents with questions they're too afraid to speak out loud. And the worker, the one who held up a nation without asking for applause, is left in the shadows of forgetfulness. But even there, in the midst of loss, something sparks. A seed of resilience, a strength born not from power, but from the heart. A worker without a job is a nation without a soul.
Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from the ashes? Comment resilience if you know that silence and chose not to stay in it. There was a time when everything went through consultations, organizations, and treaties. Today, the new powers act, without asking permission, without saying sorry, because they've understood that in a world moving this fast, waiting means losing. India signs deals with Asia and Africa without notifying anyone. China redraws trade routes while others are still debating. The European Union imposes sanctions while the UN is still drafting statements. And this new power no longer comes from control. It comes from action, from understanding that sometimes history doesn't change through speeches, but through decisions. Sometimes permission isn't asked for, it's claimed. Have you also grown tired of waiting for someone else's approval to move forward? Write it down. Sometimes true change begins the moment you stop asking for permission to be yourself. Many believe this is the end of global trade, the end of cooperation, the fall of a superpower's leadership. But it's not. This is not the end.
It's the beginning of the end, of a system that no longer represented everyone. The collapse of a structure that excluded more than it included. The downfall of a narrative that could no longer hold itself up. And in the middle of the chaos, something new is taking shape. Something fairer, more conscious. Not perfect, but more human. Because fire doesn't just burn, it purifies. Because sometimes what looks like destruction is actually transformation. Chaos doesn't destroy everything, only what no longer needs to exist. Do you feel like something is being reborn within you, even if everything around you seems to be falling apart? Comment rebirth if you're ready to embrace what's coming, even if it has no shape yet. It won't be easy. Nothing worth it ever is. But what lies ahead isn't darkness, it's revelation. And even if it feels like everything is collapsing, maybe, just maybe, we're finally letting go of what needed to end. Because when the world stops spinning around a single axis, balance is no longer a dream. It becomes a real possibility. If this spoke to you, if even one word landed in your soul, it's because you're already ready for what's coming. Subscribe. The next message will go even deeper, and not everyone is ready to hear it.